Back again, everyone. I guess I thought I'd do a little video on Paper 1, Part B. I'm going to really ad-lib on this one, go a little bit freestyle and, talk a little bit about, how to conduct evaluation and maybe just give you some general tips on how to approach Paper 1. As you would know, Paper 1 is one that you struggle with because you place such high expectations on yourselves about, knowing the real world examples in detail. Look, I wouldn't get too fussed about it. Like I said, this paper's only worth 20% towards your grade. 25 marks, raw marks, and your Part B is worth 15 marks. So if you think about it, if you do a solid Part B with, a kind of bland real world example, you might get 9 or 10 out of 15. And if you had a sprinkle of a few more real world examples, you might get 12 or 13. So, when you reduce that down to 20% overall, you're really talking about a percent, maybe two at most. So I wouldn't beat yourself up about the integration of a real world example. You do what you can. Like I kept saying in class, there's diminishing returns here. You don't want to spend too much time on it because you're not really going to get a big payoff memorizing, a substantial amount of real world examples. Okay, so question one, paper one, you have three questions. You'll have a question from micro, you'll have a question from macro, and you have a question from global. You do one of the three, and each question will have a part A and part B to do. My advice is during perusal time is way up where you think you're going to maximise your mark out of 25. Because some people, look at the part B and freak out and kind of avoid it, even though the part A might be pretty easy, or the other way around, they select part A because it's really simple, but part B, they have no clue. So my advice is make a judgment based on your combined score from A and B. That's probably the best approach to take there. I'll probably talk a little bit more about the micro, macro, global topics in another video. I guess what I want to focus on with this one is how to do evaluation, and you'll quickly see that when I go through the points I want to make about evaluation, these actually come straight from the subject report that the IB releases every year. So, this is what they want to see in Part B, but I'll come to that shortly. Once you've selected your Part B question, obviously the best thing to do is again spend maybe a couple of minutes planning. And in that plan, you obviously think about what you're going to write in your introduction, what you're going to put in your body paragraphs, and, maybe write down quickly, the real world examples that you'll be using. Students often ask me, oh, how many real world examples should I have? Should I have like 50,000? And look, the answer is, at least one. I would probably have two. Um, the more you have and the more you integrate, of course, you're going to get a better mark. But, they're the kids who are aiming for 14 or 15 out of 15. You don't have to do that. Like I said, my advice is you aim for 11 or 12 out of 15. That's really doable. And if you pick up 8 marks on Part A, you're on a 7 on Paper 1. So don't overdo it. Think strategically. Two good real world examples to integrate into your response. Okay, introduction should be short and sweet, basically indicating to the examiner, what your judgment or what your answer is going to state about the question. So again, like Part G, answer the bloody question. Absolutely do not do a brain dump. Absolutely pointless just writing everything you know about monetary policy. where you actually haven't customized your response to answer the question on monetary policy. So, you know, really think about how you're going to answer it. Like I said with the Part G video, use the phrases of the question as your topic sentences for each paragraph and go from there. The other thing I would do in the introduction is probably briefly outline your approach in terms of how you're going to answer the question and go for there. Okay, so short and sweet introduction, outline the approach, maybe just signal to the examiner that you can define or you are fully aware of the key terms that you will be using throughout your response. It should not read like a glossary. Again, it should look like your IA. The introduction on your IA, you just might have kind of define one of the key terms, and then throughout the response, define or refer to what the term means as it organically or naturally comes up in your response. After you do the introduction, the next thing I should see should be your first diagram. Okay, so remember, diagrams need to be 10 by 10, correctly labelled, centered in the page, so do not text wrap, do not write on the left-hand side or right-hand side of a diagram. The diagram should be in the middle, 10 by 10 or a third of a page, and write either above or below. In this instance, you would write below. Now, just like your micro and macro IA, probably your micro and macro responses for Part B would be showing the problem, because that's what Part B questions will be about. It'll be about evaluating or discussing the view that a particular policy is appropriate in dealing with either a micro issue or a macro issue. More on that when I go through the subject guide. So the first diagram should be showing the macro problem or the micro problem or the global problem that you are going to talk about. Obviously, the paragraph below that diagram should fully explain that diagram, what the problem is and what is the outcome of that problem or the consequence. Now, at this point, this is where I can quickly make a judgment about the quality of a response, because it's in that paragraph when you're explaining the diagram is where you should be integrating the real world example. So again, this should look like the first paragraph under your first diagram in your IA. Okay, so from your IA, you would be integrating the real world example in that first explanation paragraph that supports your diagram. After that significant paragraph, the next paragraph is where the evaluation begins. Okay, so for instance, if you're talking about monetary policy as your policy, monetary policy is the policy that's suggested in the question, then that next paragraph should be where you begin to talk about the strengths of the monetary policy in that context. So it should be about your real world example. So what are the positives about using monetary policy to solve that problem? And, unpack that. And then within that same paragraph, you should have the counterclaim. So then you start to begin to talk about maybe the negatives associated with using monetary policy to fix that problem. So again, very similar to the Part G video yesterday, claim and counterclaim, the double teal TOC structure. So teal for the claim, use teal for the counterclaim, and you're integrating the real world example. So like in Part G, you're pulling stuff out of a case study to add to your explanation. On paper 1, Part B, you're pulling out your real world example and you're adding evidence to support your claim and counterclaim that you would have about monetary policy. that should be a decent sized paragraph, a chunky paragraph, as I would like to call it, so quite a lengthy one. Once you've done that, then you can begin to think about an alternative way. You can solve a problem. So if it's unemployment's the issue or inflation's the issue, you might start off, the question might be about monetary policy, but you need to talk about alternative ways that you can fix the issue or fix the macroeconomic objective that you're trying to solve. So that would mean, you could talk about fiscal policy, you could talk about supply side policy as an alternative measure to, resolving the macroeconomic problem. And once you've explained how that fiscal policy or supply side policy would work, then you would quickly evaluate that alternative policy. Now, I would probably just do one strength and one weakness of the alternative policy, because 2/3 of your response for Part B, it should be structured around, the policy in question. The first bit should be about how the policy works to fix a problem, and then you should get into a detailed discussion or evaluation the weaknesses and strengths of using that policy in dealing with that issue that you're looking at. I can hear a helicopter flying above. Okay, so that's what I would do, and then so talk about the alternative policy that could be used to resolve the issue, and then you're etching away towards finishing off the response with a substantiated conclusion. And what I always used to say in class, you're Judge Judy in the conclusion. You're going to pass a judgment about whether or not the policy is effective or ineffective. And so you need to use the arguments that you have used in your response. You quickly outline them, and then you would say in the conclusion, I believe your monetary policy is effective in dealing with unemployment, or ineffective, but it's got to be based on your argumentation, and you've got to prioritise which of those arguments you think was the strongest one for you to support a particular side of the argument. Right, that's the basic structure. Just going to the screen now and just looking at the things that the IB, as I said, these are pretty much directly from the subject guide. So these are the things that they expect. When you're doing the evaluating, with any policy, there are strengths and weaknesses. So you should talk about the benefits and costs that might be associated with a particular policy. You can mention any trade-offs. So if you go a particular way, what you give up. Obviously, when you're looking at macro, the scope there would be you could bring in the Phillips curve if there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It just depends on the question that you're facing. As it says there, identify and explain the positive outcomes, any negative consequences, and of course then use theory and examples to both support both sides of the argument. Now I've got written there key concept. I think our thinking is changing around this. Once upon a time, we would say to you, no need to drag in a key concept. I think now there is scope to bring it in. So any one of those 9 concepts, key concepts which you think are appropriate or relevant, you could kind of lightly integrate into your response. And when I mean lightly, I wouldn't write a paragraph or anything, just a sentence or two, just to make the external examiner realise that, you're pretty comfortable with the syllabus, you understand the key concepts, and where they're relevant. Look, there's a little AI generated mini paragraph there that I put up there to give you an indication of, how you can talk about the positives and negatives, and then, think about how you can bring in the key concept. And, in the case where you're looking at policy, I mean, obviously intervention is a very strong key concept to bring in. So you can always talk a little bit about intervention and the degree of intervention that may be required to resolve an issue. Okay, second point there, consider different stakeholders. Yeah, excellent. I mean, that could be one of the themes of your evaluation paragraph. The general theme could be, you know what, I'm going to unpack the winners and losers of a particular policy, and there you actually drill down to the specifics. In particular, you could focus on the impact on consumers or producers or workers within a particular industry or particular market. You could also discuss the impact on the government, um, any kind of impact on the environment. So, you know, you can, in that case, you would bring in the key concept of sustainability. You could talk about foreigners, so foreign producers, foreign workers, foreign governments, anything you think which is relevant. So, you know, the theme would be stakeholders, and, you know, maybe the first part of the paragraph might be those particular groups of people who would benefit from the policy, you know, be it high income, middle income, low income people, or households, sorry, or, you know, whereas the second part of the paragraph when you're counterclaiming could be about the negatives that certain groups of people make, some of the negative consequences of the particular policy. Third there, the time dimension. You know, sometimes policies will have different effects in the short run or medium run or the long run. So you can canvass or investigate whether the policies that you're looking at have different consequences over time. You know, they might be pretty impotent in the short term, but coming into the long term, they may have a greater impact. You know, that may allow you to bring in elasticity as a, you know, a co-term there. But the time dimension is a very good one. Yeah, it also says there, consider whether the policy is only temporary or permanent. So sometimes governments, you know, only bring in policies for the short term, you know, maybe to get some votes, and then once they're elected, they might kind of dump the policy, or, you know, the policy gets introduced and they realise it's totally ineffective, and, you know, then they remove it. Okay, or it's successful, you know, and they decide to keep it. So, you know, if you think about the Australian context, it could be, you know, you could look at the subsidies for solar panels. You could look at the recent policy announced by the Albanese government to bring in batteries for households, and, you know, the quick uptake. People are really loving it. People signing up for it, and so the government may decide that, you know, oh, it's costing us too much money. We better end it soon, or they may really enjoy having people sign up and take, you know, household batteries, so they may extend the project. So, you know, it just depends on the real world example. But don't forget, time is a great theme for an evaluation paragraph. Now, number 4, if you think of, you know, when we taught you CLASP or VSLAP, the P stands for prioritise. So, you know, weigh up the relative importance or significance of certain benefits or costs. So again, when you're thinking about your topic sentences, um, when you think about the topic sentences, maybe start with, you know, one of the main benefits or the most significant benefit of this particular policy is blah, 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 or one of the key negatives or key weaknesses or limitations or main limitations is blah, blah, blah. So really, you know, it's a skill thing. Constantly talk about signposting. Again, examiners are pushed for time, especially external examiners. They're rushed into, you know, marking their papers really quickly. You think about you're going to finish your exam on Monday. within a few weeks you're going to get results. So these people don't have a lot of time. They're probably doing it while they're working full time. So again, anything you can do to make their life easier, especially signposting, especially structuring your paragraphs based on themes, having a claim and counterclaim. This is all really good stuff to score well on evaluation. So yep, just weigh up the significance of the consequences that you're looking at. That's a very good thing to do. And then finally, this is really important, the fifth one there, explore alternative policies or perspectives. The question in Part B doesn't tell you explicitly to explore another policy, but in every marking guide, it is essential that you do talk about an alternative policy. So like I said, if you're thinking macro, if the question is about monetary policy, you need to suggest maybe how fiscal or supply side policies can be used to, maintain or to be able to achieve a particular macroeconomic objective. If you think about microeconomics, if you're looking at a particular type of market failure, do you have a market-based solution or do you have an interventionist-based solution? If you think of the topic of externalities, taxes and subsidies, tradable permits, or could a better outcome be achieved by using regulation and legislation? Or could you just launch an information campaign that might be effective? So it is imperative, it is essential that you actually talk about an alternative policy, even though it's not directly or explicitly asked for. You must do that in Part B, okay? So, keep that in mind. Yeah, I think they're the main things. I've got a couple of questions there that have come from previous exams. You can see, I can't remember when this exam question was set, but this was a Part B a few years ago. It's looking at the consumption of demerit goods is best reduced through legislation and regulation. So the approach there is, firstly, once you get through your introduction, you might quickly define what demerit goods are. You might also mention what legislation and regulation is. And then you have your first diagram, which is your problem. So you would show what the problem is with demerit goods, explain why it's a problem, why it's a market failure, and then you would give a real world example of where legislation and regulation is used to alleviate the market failure. And then you would start to pull it apart. So you would, talk about the strengths of using legislation and regulation, and then that would be immediately followed by, some of the weaknesses of using that approach of using legislation and regulation. So that's your first 2/3 of your essay. The last third of the essay would be canvassing other approaches to alleviate the market failure around demerit goods. So it might be looking at, market-based solutions or, providing a public information campaign that encourages people to reduce their demerit good consumption. So, yeah, just, whatever the real-world example is, that's the way you approach it. The question part B there, where you got discuss the effectiveness of fiscal policy in reducing the level of unemployment. Obviously, in the opening, you would kind of refer to what fiscal policy is, what unemployment is in general, just a general definition of unemployment. First diagram would be, showing a scenario where unemployment is an issue. You could I would use probably an ADAS diagram, and then you would show the policy solution is, how does fiscal policy alleviate unemployment? So, you obviously shift the aggregate demand curve to the right through a combination of increased government spending or cut in taxation, close the output gap, talk about the strengths of fiscal policy, and then talk about the weaknesses of fiscal policy. Try to blend in your real world example throughout. And again, that represents the first 2/3 of your essay. The final third of your essay should be around, what is there a better way of getting rid of unemployment? And that could be, using monetary policy, or it could be using supply side policies, and then whichever one you mention, or you might mention both, just quickly evaluate those alternative policies. So quickly give one strength, one weakness of using monetary policy or supply side policy in dealing with unemployment. The thing you could also do there for unemployment is talk about the different types of unemployment. So, cyclical, seasonal, structural, frictional. Obviously, fiscal policy and monetary policy, because they're demand-sided policies, might be more effective in dealing with cyclical unemployment. But when it comes to structural unemployment, then, things like monetary policy or fiscal policy, which is just demand orientated, will be not so effective. And so supply side policy or supply side fiscal policy might be more effective in fixing up structural unemployment. So they leave it pretty vague. HL questions are pretty vague, so it allows you to explore the syllabus points in greater detail than, say, your SL peers. If you look at Part B there, the final one there about using market-based supply-side policies and reducing the level of unemployment. So again, in the intro, you talk about what market-based supply-side policies are. You talk about what unemployment is, and then you diagram the problem and the policy solution, would show how market-based supply-side policies would work. And then you would do a significant evaluation on the strengths and weaknesses of market-based policies. The alternative policies that you would need to mention could be interventionist supply-side policies, might be more effective for particular types of unemployment, or again, you could lapse into a discussion that maybe fiscal and monetary policy might be more effective in bringing down unemployment, especially if it's cyclical unemployment. Okay, so look, sorry for being ad lib, but I'm getting pretty tired. But yeah, that might give you some ideas. I hope later on I'll pull out the subject guide on screen and just walk you through possibly what some of the micro and macro Part B questions could be, and the global ones as well. So it might just give you an indication of what to expect or what to prepare for. My advice is work to your strength. I would not, for paper one, I would not focus on one unit. I would probably focus on 2 units. So it could be micro and macro, it could be macro and global, it could be micro and global. I would prepare for 2 units. That would be the sensible thing to do. But like I said at the start, don't overly stress about the real world examples. Work within your limitations. Be happy with it. Anything from 10 to 12 out of 15. If you nail the first Part A question, getting 8. And if you get 12 or 11 out of 15, you're pretty much on 7 territory for paper 1. So look, 2 good real world examples. Make them contemporary. Don't talk about the Great Depression, because it's unlikely you're going to get a question about the Great Depression. They're probably a little bit sick of reading the GFC and the COVID pandemic, which may be COVID pandemic, to be fair, might be a bit more relevant. Use AI to generate your real world examples. Ask it to come up with contemporary examples over the last 2-3 years. Get it to create a few bullet points, and then a couple of pieces of data. Now it's up to you. Like I said, don't go over the top for real world examples. There is diminishing returns. Just have 1 or 2 ones to go to, and you should be right. Where possible, you could always use your IAs as examples if they're relevant to the question that appears on the exam and the one that you select. Okay, signing off for now. Probably catch up either later today or tonight, or maybe tomorrow morning. Okay, guys, all the best. Thanks.